Hi there! Welcome to my studio. I'm getting ready to start a demonstration of the techniques that I used to create this Smokey portrait painting. Alright, so here we are. First of all, I love these black wing pencils. They have the type of graphite inside of them that lets them go from very light to very dark. So initially, and what you can see on the thumbnail of my previous video, is I made a full grisaille sketch underneath. All of this paint you'll find a full tonal value sketch just so that I can get all of the tones properly laid in and know where my lights and shadows are. And especially with a cat like Smokey, it is very important to capture his exact stripe pattern because that's unique to each cat. So for this demonstration, I'm just going to lay in a quick patch of stripes, just as if I would have been, laying them in on his arms or his leg, just to give a quick overview of how I made all of this come together. So now that I have my under sketch, and obviously this is very basic for the demonstration, I wanted to go through and show some of the colors that I used. And just because I wanted to keep this demo pretty short, I am going to use this paper as my palette and just have this be a documentation of what I do. Alright. For pet stripes, I always start with Liquitex Acrylic's Burnt Umber. And then I like to mix in ultramarine blue. So the very first thing that I always do is mix up the darkest colors. Yes, so I always start with ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And the other secret of this portrait is the ultra matte medium. This extends the color, it makes everything matte, and it also makes things slightly more transparent. So I'm actually not using too much of it going in with the dark stripes. I'm actually wanting to keep a little bit of that. I want to keep it so that it's not too transparent. So basically I go in, and even though this looks white, it is not white. It is the matte medium, so it's not actually adding any white. It just looks like it from a distance. But basically I like to have the stripes lean more cool toned, so I'm gonna go ahead and I always twist my brush and pull out so that it has a nice sharp tip, and then I go over where the darkest parts of the stripes are. So I start in the middle of the stripe and then I just feather it up, and then I feather it down, and this helps keep all of the fur patches looking even and maintained with the distance to each other. And especially when I'm doing client portrait commissions, I make sure that I get the right ratio of dark patches to light patches, because stripes are very important for capturing the likeness of a pet. So you'll see on the paper, this is a very dark blue-black, and that will actually help because these stripes will end up being more neutral toned once I add in the lighter stripes on top. So just kind of trying to loosely get those fur patches in, and then here I'm being very careful not to obscure this little patch of light fur poking through, because you'll see in like different parts of his fur, especially like with his arms up here, he has several areas that are dark patch with a light stripe in between, and that is crucial to being able to capture his actual fur coat. And then sometimes I like to trail off and dry brush a little bit, just so that there's a little bit of gradation and nuance to the stripes and the types of stripes that I'm doing. So let me go ahead and clean off my brush. And I always have a paper towel nearby so that I can dab my brush off before I continue working. But then the second color that I always add for fur is I go in with the burnt sienna. So burnt sienna is a much warmer toned brown. It's almost orange, but the burnt part of the sienna is what makes it a brown instead of an orange. And actually, I didn't even use any orange paint within this painting. It's all burnt sienna and burnt umber doing the heavy lifting. So I am going to just very carefully add in a little bit of the burnt umber and a little bit of the matte medium. Actually, quite a lot of the matte medium because I don't want this to be too opaque. And from there, if the light is kind of coming from this upwards direction, I'm going to start where the fur will be the darkest. And you see how using that matte medium, I can just go right over the stripes I've already made, and it doesn't obscure them. That is why I've been trying to hone my skills with using this matte medium, because it has been so wonderful to be able to layer and gradiate with it. It's helped my acrylic paint mixing so much. And then I just kind of keep layering it up. And you can see that already right now it's blended. So as I'm losing more paint on my brush, that means that it's going to get lighter towards where the light is coming from. I'm just going to feather that out a little bit because this is just a quick demo on paper. But you can already kind of tell how, watching how the form wraps, like this is pretty much exactly the technique that I used on this back part of his fur. So let me go ahead and clean my brush one more time. So the next thing that I did was I actually went through, and for this painting I got a larger tube of the dioxazine purple, because this purple is so dark that it's almost black, but it's slightly different from the ultramarine blue in the way that it neutralizes the orange, because the ultramarine blue will actually make the orangey yellow part of the burnt sienna into a kind of cool tone gray green. And obviously I did not want any gray green in my cat. I wanted to keep all the blues and greens and cool tones to the background. So when I went in with this dioxazine purple, and this is really cool. I love color mixing and color theory, but that is a very, very vibrant purple, obviously. It's a dark but vibrant color. Very, very gorgeous royal purple. I'm going to just take a bit of this burnt sienna, and immediately you'll see this kind of go into an almost reddish tint. And you'll see how that kind of just neutralizes the orange tone. So adding a bit more of the matte medium, you'll see that this will just add a nice layer of shadow without making anything too muddy or gray. And then I'm avoiding the little patches where the light's going to be wrapping around the form. And that's kind of how I went through this. I think that I used a slightly cooler mix of it for the fur. So I'm actually going to try to replicate that by adding a little bit. Well, I guess that was a lot of it by accident, but it's okay. I'm adding ultramarine blue and then a little bit more burnt sienna so that I can neutralize that, and then a little bit more. It's a very delicate balance when you're mixing color tones. But here, I think this is closer to the actual color that I used for the painting, so I'm going to go ahead and layer that a little more. And you can see how that kind of just unifies everything and creates this nice little texture patch of the color. And then obviously, of course, highlights. So once all of the shadows are finished, that's when I like to go in with my highlights. And for highlights, I like to use a significantly smaller brush. So let me grab my little, this is a 10/0 Zen Royal Langnickel brush, and it is basically like maybe 4 hairs, maybe 5. But it is a very thin, skinny brush. So let me go ahead and wet that down. You can see how thin and fine that is. And obviously this is what I used for his whiskers. But when I'm adding my highlights, so when I'm setting up my palette, I normally like to use like random plastic objects for palettes. I mean, for for reference, I am using an egg carton that we had as my paintbrush water holder, just because then I can go into the different wells and keep it separated by how much is dirty and which ones are cleaner. In any case, I like to set up my palettes by having all of the cool and deep tones on one side and all of the lighter, more warm tones on the other. Here comes another trade secret. So normally when people think of highlights, they reach for titanium white, and you have to be very careful using titanium white because it can make anything look chalky very fast. So instead of just using titanium white, I have started using unbleached titanium, which is the same type of base tone for the highlights, but it's just less chalky, and it has a warmer undertone. And if you can see where I'm going with this, if I use the unbleached titanium with this gorgeous like orangey burnt sienna, you get the exact tones that Smokey's like underbelly and his chin have. So let me go ahead and get some of that on my palette. Just a little doop, a little dollop. And of course, I also like to add more matte medium. When in doubt, I add matte medium. So let me go ahead and grab some of this. And I want to make this a very, very, very thin mix. I do not want a lot of pigment in this because it is very opaque. Like the titanium white colors are very opaque very fast. So I'm going to just dip and grab a little bit of this burnt sienna and just kind of make an in-between, because I don't want to go in directly with like the brightest highlights ever, because that would be a little bit harsh. So I feel like this is a good in-between, and I'm just gonna gently feather in the highlights. Once again, it's all about feathering. Just gently turning the form. Getting some of those highlights at the very edge of the fur as well. And this also breaks up the stripes a little bit. Oh, and you see it got a little bit too opaque, so I'm going to go ahead and try to thin that out and make it into a highlight that's more intentional looking. Yeah, and then I'll go ahead and keep heading towards that more opaque white. Kind of even it out up here. And you can see how several hours of layering like this and dabbing out when it gets a little bit too much, layering it back and forth, and then obviously if I see how the acrylic dries, fun fact, acrylic paint does not dry the color that it comes out. It dries like 2 to 3 shades darker sometimes. So because of how I feel like some of the darker stripes got lost in the shadow, because my palette is still wet enough, I can go back in and reinstate some of those shadows, just like right here, gently with the same small brush I was just using, and I can make that a little darker. I can make this a little darker. But then in some places, like right over here in this kind of like underbelly area, I ended up letting the shadows stay a little bit more muted because I wanted the highlight focal point to be this section of his face. And I didn't want to have any of the dark shadows be competing with the point that has the only place in the entire painting that has the white next to pure black is right next to his eye. And that's because obviously it's where I want people to look. It's where I want to lead the viewer's eye. And actually, I might add just 1 or 2 little... I've been staring at this painting from a distance for about a day now, and I wanted to fix just one little area before I submit it for the competition. I wanted this part of his muzzle to be a little brighter, but not pure white. Just because I felt like it needed to have that 3D form turn more accurately. So I'm just going to gently do that. Yeah, and I think that helped a little bit with some of the things I was seeing. But like I said, this is kind of just, you know, what I did for the next 2 to 3 hours of painting. It was just, once the layer dried, I went back in, and sometimes it would be the same exact mix, and because I'm using the matte medium, I can layer it up and finalize different parts of the form from just layer upon layer. And anytime something like that happened, I could just dab it out. But yeah, if you're curious about any other part of this painting, or how I did the door, how I did the background, let me know and I will do another quick demo video. But that's essentially just how I do the push and pull of different parts of my paintings. And one other thing that I wanted to do before I put all of my paints away and before I photographed this for the submission is I believe that I wanted this to have a slightly larger highlight. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that his whiskers were even. And that's kind of the secret, where if you don't like how much something has been pulled out, you can pull it back and just kind of drag it along, because sometimes his whiskers catch the light and then they don't actually fully come back out. Like sometimes his whiskers end up staying part of the background. And then, what I always like to do when I'm finished with my painting and the palette has been used as much as I want it to be, I will take the biggest brush that I happen to have at the time, and I will just kind of swipe, 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 and I will get a nice little neutral color mixed up. And what I will do with this neutral color, and obviously I didn't have enough of it to be able to do anything meaningful, because I was very specifically not trying to get too much paint out for this demo. What I normally do with the extra paint that I have on my palette is I will take this neutral color that's been mixed up and I will use it to prime another canvas. That way I'm not working on pure white anymore. That's the way I prefer to work for my still life paintings, but yeah, I didn't have enough for this time, so I'm just gonna make a little square, and then maybe I can do like a little study or something. Because that's the other thing I've been trying to do, is do more painting studies, and yeah, I think that could be nice. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I really appreciate all the support that I've been getting. I've had a blast coming back to being an art content creator, and yeah, I'm just curious if anyone else has used acrylic matte medium before. Please let me know. If you're curious to try it and you have any questions about the process or ways that you set it up, let me know. I'm always looking at the comments to see if someone has anything that they need from me, because you know, I'm excited to help people, and I love helping people be more creative. So I really appreciate you joining me in my studio today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. See you next Thursday.